Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burak of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest. He is editor of the Hat Trick Letter, found on goldenjackass.com. Jim Willie, thank you for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure being on.
Now, Jim, there's so much going on right now. I want to ask you a few different questions that other people don't ask you, just to get your opinion on this. Why are the banks and politicians moving things towards a cashless society?
Well, to begin with, we must recall that we're dealing with Reich finance here. We're dealing with a bunch of fascists who've been in control of the banking system for a few decades, ever since they killed Kennedy and installed Kissinger and took control of the Department of Treasury with Rubin, etc. So we're seeing desperation as they have reached the last stages of losing control. So the system is basically broken, and it's sort of a fitting end for the death of money and the death of capital to see them try to bring about the death of cash. And it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. It'll never work, not even in industrialized nations and not even in big cities. Because, gee, what's the hot dog vendor with the push cart going to take? You're going to put them all out of business? I think that would wipe out 5% of the GDP of New York City. There's wreckage of the system from monetary inflation gone amok. This is a last-ditch effort to avert the installation of the gold standard. But look at the broken pieces. You get bank CDs that pay next to nothing. I talked to my father and say, you know, on the ones a few years ago that you had to roll over, what are you getting on them? And he said, 1.5%, 1.7% at some places. I said, well, that's nothing. So they've wrecked the system. They've wrecked the interest-bearing mechanisms there. And look at the interest rates. You got, 20 nations offering negative interest rates? It's gone so out of control that in Spain, they operate by the Euribor interest rate, which is the European overnight bank rate, as opposed to the London overnight bank rate. And they're actually paying out to Spanish homeowners on the very short-term adjustable mortgages. They're paying them money now because it's a negative rate. These are broken elements. You've got the dollar swap line rate that the Fed operates. It's approaching negative. You got the LIBOR short-term rate in addition to the Euribor. That's approaching a negative rate. You've got reverse repos that are a mess right now, and they're sometimes flirting with negative rates. So this is kind of like the bully in the yard, the schoolyard, who steals the marbles. They want to get rid of the cash in the system. And, you know, why wouldn't they want to get rid of cash in the system when they don't want to give cash at the teller windows on legitimate bank account holdings? This is fascism control a la Big Brother. It'll never work. It's a sign of the banker cabal being removed from the control center. Let them try. I want them to try to confiscate gold. Let them try. Let them expose themselves. This is, this cash society drivel. It's like the last stage and the last hurrah and the last gasp by banker cabals, and I think their last deed that they will get away with is some bank account confiscations.
Yeah, I think there's many reasons why they're going for this cashless society, Jim, and I'll name you some of them right now. You know, I just saw this Edward Snowden documentary, Citizen4. It won the Oscar. It's brought up some really interesting things in there. We've seen what they've tried to do, you know, with the really big rabble-rousers like Julian Assange of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden. If they go to a cashless society, you know, they could just remove you from the system financially. They can shut down your bank accounts, your credit cards very quickly, and then how do you buy food and groceries then? So I think that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is they're so desperate to find different sources of tax revenue that I guess, you know, in Europe there's a large amount of undocumented workers and other people coming in from other countries in Europe and also in the United States, where people are working off the books for cash, that the governments, I guess, just all want, 1%, 2%. They want a piece of this pie so they can increase the layers. And there's so many other reasons, we could do this, whether it's Keynesian economics, that Keynesians want to allocate the capital, they want to euthanize the rentier. So there's many different reasons, I think, why they're trying to go to this cashless society. And, maybe they combine this with bail-ins and bailouts going forward to exert more control over us.
Well, I agree completely. You're getting at the real heart of the problem for their methods and the devices. They're going after exclusion of unwanted people, like me, for instance. They might want to exclude me from the system, so I can't even get, say, a cell phone, or I couldn't even get internet service, or I couldn't buy a computer, or I couldn't even buy shoes. Okay, but they're also trying to bring in more tax revenue, to be sure. I've known a lot of people, plumbers and carpenters and whatever, pardon me, who just work under the system on their Saturdays and make a good deal of money on the side. So to be sure, that's part of what I called fascist control a la Big Brother. I didn't say control to do what. You filled in the blanks there, and I agree completely.
Now, my next question, Jim, I touched briefly on Keynesian economics, and I think a lot of what's going on is kind of the epilogue of what Keynes wrote in his general theory about euthanizing the rentier, and, we're here with negative interest rates. But when I listen to CNBC or Bloomberg, they talk about deflation, but look at the asset prices. Why don't Keynesian economists consider asset prices going up a lot as evidence of inflation?
Well, I like to always give a preface on questions like this. Related to this topic, just think of all the words that they've come up with that are very difficult to define. You have inflation, deflation, disinflation, reflation, and I defy the normal person to define them all correctly. But the answer, I think, is kind of simple, because if they label the stocks and bonds as being evidence of inflation, they would be exposing QE as flawed. QE is to buy bonds. Therefore, the interest rate goes down, the bond yields go down, and the principal value goes up. Well, just make sure that while the interest rate is falling, that the American public doesn't focus too much on the absence of profitability in the big corporations, especially U.S. operations. They have the Fed and Wall Street buying a lot of bonds. And I think there's sort of like government orders, make sure you keep those stocks up, because when the stocks go down, you start to see alerts and panics from the American public, because they've got their mutual funds, 401ks, IRAs, and for the really independent types, the KIOs. So, I've got only one time in the last 6 or 7 years where a family member has called me in a slight panic. And it was in early 2009 when my younger sister called me and was worried about her 7-figure 401k. And I advised her to do various things related to gold and silver, but I prefaced it by saying, I don't think you're going to like anything I suggest. And when we were done, she told me, no, she didn't like anything I suggested. I said, good, let's not ever talk about this again, because in a few years, you're going to be in a different kind of panic where your money's going to vanish, and it's not going to be my fault, and I'm really not going to give a damn. So let's not talk about this. Okay, so really, this whole concept of lifting up asset prices is kind of a cousin concept of not in my backyard for toxic dump sites. The Fed is acting like a toxic generator of toxic paper, and they don't want you to say, yeah, but you're making the bond market toxic, and worse, you're making the dollar toxic. So it's really an issue of the financial arena receiving the so-called benefit as opposed to the tangible economy. What they're actually doing is they're wrecking capital by forcing an international procedure toward hedging against the dollar, which lifts hard asset prices and the entire cost structure. And when you see higher costs for American businesses and European businesses too, they lose their profit margins and they shut down a segment of the business or the entire small business or mid-sized business. And you see a death of capital. They retire the machines. They take them offline. They put the machines in a warehouse. They liquidate them. They sell them. That's what I call the death of capital. So QE is killing capital, but they like to point to, oh, no, look at all that. You get the wealth effect. The wealth effect in your stocks. Now, the public does not own bonds. The banks own bonds. So the banks are engaged in carry trade, where Wall Street firms, this is something you're very familiar with, the Wall Street firms take the free money, borrow it, and invest in long bonds, and with the differential, they arbitrage it, take a profit, maybe even put on some future contracts, amplify with something like 30 to 1 leverage, and they make a lot of money. So there's a wealth effect in big spades for Wall Street, while there's a wealth effect for the American public who sees their 401ks and their stock mutual funds are all going up. What they should do is sell them because the Fed's the main buyer along with the Wall Street firms. This is U.S. society will not react badly until stocks are down hard and bank accounts are, showing missing holes. I mean, this is the economic maestros that believe that income wreckage is offset by mutual fund gains. This is sickening conclusion for the King Dollar era. I'm convinced, and I see evidence here, there, and everywhere, that the Fed and Wall Street own over 50% of the S&P 500 stocks. So, this is game over. They're wrecking the bond market. And that evidence is all over the place. So, whatever they touch with their unusual policy by the Politburo from the United States, I love that term because we used to denigrate the Russians and the Soviets for their Politburo and their central committees and their planned economies and their completely forced ruble exchange rate. Well, that's what we have. We have an exchange stabilization fund that gets it all done by rigging the markets. No, we're going down the same, what's the word, dead-end alleyway. And QE is really the marquee billboard all along this way. I love the saying we're kicking the can down the road, but it's turned nuclear and we're running out of road.
Yeah, I mean, the asset prices, Jim, whether it's stocks, bonds, real estate, diamonds, artwork, we've seen record art auctions. This quantitative easing program, whether it's the U.S. or Europe or Japan, it seems to really only be benefiting government so they can continue to borrow more and more money cheaply as possible. Seems to only be benefiting Wall Street investment banks and hedge funds and the very, very rich who own a lot of, diversified asset portfolio where, they have expensive artwork and diamonds and a whole bunch of real estate holdings and things like that. The money, there's so many statistics pointing to the real economy in the United States and elsewhere where it's not improving at all.
Oh, gosh, we had 6,000 retail outlets, stores announced as shutting down in the next year or year plus. I just saw something called the Chap CPI index. I think I got the name right, Chap. And
yeah,
he
I
had
heard about it too.
Yeah, he manages 500 items in a basket and has been following the prices consistently, which is not an easy thing to do if they change the volume of the item. For instance, if they redeclare this is one of my favorite lines. They redeclare what a half gallon is. The half gallon of milk is now just 90% of a half gallon, but the price is the same. All right, so it's a deflation of the volume.
I think he measures by unit. Yeah.
Well, I think he would have to make it sensible, but the conclusion of this Chapwood CPI is that for almost every, not just major city, of almost every well-known city in the United States, and he followed 50 of them, the consumer price index that he maintained on the basket was right in the 10% range, 10 plus or minus 1 or 2%. There were a couple of readings, like New York City had one year that was 13%. I noticed California had higher across the board than almost all the other states. California's big cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego. They didn't include my old original town of Pittsburgh, but they had Boston in there, and it also was around 10%. They had Columbus, Ohio, which is the closest big city, Cleveland and Columbus, to Pittsburgh, and they were right around 10%. But here's what the point I'm mentioning regarding this Chap-Wood index. If you did a population weighting of this index to come up with an aggregate, of course it would not be a rural inclusion, but it would be an urban United States economic CPI aggregate reading. And I'm sure, based on all I saw there, that it would be in the 10% range. So when they claim that price inflation is 2 to 3%, they're going to be wrong by at least 7%. So if they claim that we've got this 1%, 2% growth on the GDP, it's really -4 and -5% recession since 2008, which is what I've been claiming. And he had a conclusion that in the last 4 years, we've had a 21% economic recession. So we're wrecking the system. QE is accelerating this decline in the economy, and the one picture better than any other that shows the failure of policy is the fast rise in monetary printing, monetary aggregate, the money supply, on the same graph showing the decline in money velocity, which is defined as the nominal amount of goods and services sold within the nation divided by its total money supply. So it's the round-trip cycles of money. It's down 50% since Lehman Brothers. This is a grotesque failure of monetary policy. But let's call it what it really is. QE is a backdoor Wall Street bailout.
Yeah, Jim, and I think all the statistics the government uses, you talked about the Chap-Wood Index, which is, I think, new, and I just found it. I think it's great. I think he surveys actually a whole bunch of people in these different cities so they can submit data on these items, and he checks them out for units and things like that. So he's doing a good job compared to what's being done at Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I think what's happened is, if you go back and look what the Soviet Union did with a lot of their economic data and statistics, I actually read this book. It was about Google. It was called In the Plex, and I didn't expect to find this juicy little tidbit in there, but they talked about Sergey Brin, who's the co-founder of Google's father, and his father was a Soviet-era economist, and he was tasked in the Soviet Union with constantly changing all the formula and data and equations that the Soviets would release, and they would release, formulas saying that there was no inflation rate, and they would routinely update the formulas, right, to lie about that there was no inflation in the Soviet Union, and they would routinely release, these propaganda economic data saying that the standard of living in the Soviet Union for the average Soviet citizen was higher than the average American citizen. So I think we've gotten to that level of, lies, and you're a PhD statistician. Maybe some of the inputs are not that bad, but, they can do different things with weightings and stuff like that to change things around to make things look, how they want to make them look.
Well, they can do a number of things. I've noticed that there's been some open criticism just in the last couple of months because we've got some economic statistics that seem to have the seasonal adjustments. Like, for instance, a couple months might be the slowest of the year, like, say, October, November. Those are not big months for business. But December is. All right, so what they do is they take some seasonal adjustments, and they say, well, we're gonna adjust for the low season here and kind of smooth out the sine wave, if you will, to make it more flat and make comparisons more valid. what they've done in the last 2 months is to apply twice over the seasonality adjustment to lift it up. I mean, they're running out of things to use for excuses, like, oh gosh, we had bad weather that month. Well, okay, fine, but it's June and we don't have bad weather. So what do? It's June, so let's apply twice the seasonal adjustment, or in April. The other thing they do that is doctoring the data, and these are very simple. I like to joke and mock the stat rats in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau both. I like to mock them by saying it only takes 7th grade arithmetic to debunk their shit. That's all you need. Now, here's something that's clever. It's called the birth-death model. And what they reason is that when they do the household survey and the other surveys regarding employment, they reason that, well, gosh, in the last 3 months, there have been more creations of small businesses, and we're overlooking them. So let's put in an estimate of what they would be based on a certain model, and that will be called the birth-death model adjustment. And you see some obscene numbers come from the birth-death model. And it's absolutely ludicrous, because in this environment, it is precisely the small businesses that are getting crushed by monetary policy, because the small businesses don't have an Indian subsidiary or a Brazilian subsidiary to help them out. They're stuck in the United States. And furthermore, they're stuck with Obamacare costs. So they got a double whammy, the small business sector does. That doesn't stop the merry marching of the birth-death model as a contributing force to the employment. We've got 22% unemployment in the United States when you happen to count those who don't have a job.
Yeah, and a lot of the ones...
It's funny, Jason.
Yeah, and a lot of the ones that do have a job, Jim, they have a part-time job or a couple of part-time jobs. And to add to your points there, about the jobs numbers, not just the birth-death model, but, there was way over, if you looked at the press releases for the oil companies, right, when the shale boom went bust, how many jobs were lost. There was over 100,000 direct jobs that were cut, and the government numbers didn't count 100,000 jobs that were cut. So, and there was obvious evidence that there was 100,000 jobs. I've actually heard even more than that. I've heard from another source that there was almost 250,000 direct oil and gas jobs cut, and that's not counting the indirect ones. So, I think that a lot of the numbers are pretty bogus, pretty much across the board with pretty much every formula that you're looking at. I'm not sure where there's honesty in any of the numbers really anymore.
No, just like there's no honesty in any of the financial markets. If you want to get a good indicator of the oil industry and the employment aspect to that industry, just take a look at the Dallas Fed. I think they came out this morning or yesterday with another absolutely horrendous report. Horrendous. A consecutive string of horrendous. I mean, we're not hearing the clowns in Washington talk about a sluggish recovery anymore. They're talking about the war, and they're talking about, defensive policemen who murder citizens.
Yeah, they're talking about foreign enemies like Putin and so many others. I guess they're trying to shift the blame here, because it looks like, their economic predictions of, we're going to have a recovery, and we're going to be able to raise interest rates because the economy is doing so well. Those don't look like they're going to pay off for the government right now.
Jason, can we say that the U.S. economy is suffering from the Ukraine war? This is how stupid it's getting. Oh, those sanctions, those reverse sanctions banning food that the Russians slapped on in retaliation, that's having a marked effect on the U.S. economy. Not. Oh,
well, I want to...
It's ludicrous.
Yeah, I agree. Pretty much everything in the mainstream media is ludicrous now. I want to transition to the next topic here. There's a lot of sources that I read that say that China is planning on some type of bond monetization program, some version of quantitative easing, where their massive municipal bond debt is bought up and durations of the bonds are extended and interest rates are pushed lower. I guess it's their version of financial repression. Where do you think this ties in then with China joining the SDR and announcing an update to their official public gold reserves?
Well, to begin with, the United States, with the Fed and the Euro Central Bank and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan, that foursome, they are in charge of global QE. There's no doubt about that. So what they would like to see is the Chinese join the global QE. And it's not going to happen. Just not going to happen. They may have a debt problem. They may have an asset bubble problem. But what China does not have is any externally held debt of Chinese debt. No foreign parties own China's debt. And when it comes to the United States, we're over 50%. I think we're around 55%. So here's how I think it's going to play out. The Chinese are using the IMF, and I'll get into the sequence in a minute, but I think the Chinese are involved in a multi-step process here where they're going to be reinstituting the gold standard internationally, starting with the East, the Eastern Hemisphere, Asia, Russia, and all of Asia, maybe not Japan and not the Philippines because they're under constant threat of murder if they don't comply to the U.S. wishes. But with the reinstitution of the gold standard, you're going to see a market increase. I don't want to get into how much. You're going to see a market increase in the gold price. And China is going to manage their debt problem with the higher gold price. They're not going to manage their debt problem with printing trillions like the Americans did. Now, here's what I think is going to go on. I pay no attention to official gold reserve holdings. I know you didn't couch that in your question, but we talked about this a little bit beforehand. We've got the nonsense where I think it was back 4 years ago, the Chinese updated and said we have 1,045 tons of gold.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so funny. Now you've got these shills like Rickards and other morons who are not as smart as Rickards. Rickards is a smart guy, no doubt about that. But I never trust anybody who talks that fast. But you've got a lot of speculation that the Russians and Chinese are going to come out with updates on their official reserves. I don't give a rat's ass about their official reserves. I care about their accessible reserves in gold that will be made available by, say, sovereign wealth funds and very wealthy families. Let me just ask a simple question. When it comes to the United States gold reserves, okay, I'm not even going to get into the question of whether Fort Knox is empty or not, because I'm pretty sure it's got exactly zero or maybe a barrel full of old coins in it, in addition to the nerve gas that they're using the repository for. But when you're calculating the U.S. government gold reserves, do you count the amount of gold that's in the Wall Street executive accounts in the Carlyle Group? Do you count the Rockefeller gold bullion account? Of course not. You count Fort Knox and its fraudulent accounting, deep storage gold. So you've got sovereign wealth funds in China, namely the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, SAFE, and the China Investment Corp, CIC. The bigger one, I think it's like 8 times or 10 times bigger, is SAFE. These are near trillion-dollar funds that are not counted in anything for official Chinese assets for gold. We don't know what they have because they're privately managed. Well, there's no such thing as private in China, but they're secretly managed. Now, here's another one. when you look at the Forbes list of the most wealthy Americans, why isn't Papa Bush number one with his $4 or $5 trillion in drug money?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not that familiar. But in terms of China's new gold fund that they're coming out with 60 countries and funded by $16 billion at least, do you think this is gonna take out all the remaining gold that's in the West?
Oh, I think it's pretty much been taken out already, except for the two principal stockpiles of Basel, Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements, and the Vatican. The Vatican will always have very high tonnage. But I think this new window that was announced on Saturday for accessing and sourcing more gold, I think it's going to be used in Shanghai as a primary window for converting treasury bonds into gold bullion. If you took a pile of all the sovereign bonds in the major nations of the West, I think 90% of it or 80% of it would be treasury bonds from the U.S. You'd still see quite a lot from Euro bonds, and you'd have UK gilts. And Japan is pretty private about their Japanese government bonds, JGB. So I think Euro bonds and treasuries, predominantly treasury bonds, would be used at this window to source gold. So this is what I believe, say, South Korea and Taiwan will use to convert their treasuries to gold bullion and replenish their banking system. Here's how I think it's going to play out, though, in a sequence. The IMF strategy is being used by China as a Trojan horse. They've got permission now to include the Chinese yuan. I'm going to call it the RMB for renminbi. So they're going to have RMB inclusion in the SDR, special drawing rights of the IMF. And that includes the dollar, the euro, the pound, and the yen. So it's now going to have a fifth entry, the RMB. It's a brilliant move. The Voice has confirmed in his opinion that it's a Trojan horse. That's what I called it, along with a couple of guys in my colleague group. And how do I mean that it's a Trojan horse? Well, to begin with, the IMF is pretty much an empty office. It doesn't even have a bank account. Now, when you hear about a Ukraine loan from the IMF, take a look at the details, and the loan is granted only after new money is printed by the Euro Central Bank or with permission and pledges of collateral or something or other by France or Germany or other European member nations to the European Union. So the IMF is broke. So who gives a rat? Who gives a rat about a policy except for the hidden motive, which is to encourage the major nations, whenever they do come up with funds for the IMF, that some of them will have to be in the weighting of the RMB, the Chinese currency. Now that's going to have a consequence that the Western press and financial analysts don't talk about. It's going to mean all the Asian and Eurasian countries with their central banks are going to start buying up Chinese government bonds. And they're going to push out treasuries. So in come the RMB bonds, out go U.S. bonds, and in the process they're going to be loading up with some gold bullion. So this is kind of a trigger point at the starting gate. All right, gentlemen, start your engines. Get ready to buy some RMB bonds. Well, in order to do that, they push out something else in their reserves, and that's going to be treasuries. And while they're buying RMB, they're going to be buying some gold. So this is a beginning process of seeding, the seeding process for gold and RMB across the world. And the RMB already has a tremendous starting point. They got tremendous momentum already. We got about 30 different yuan swap facilities for bilateral trade between China and other nations, all kinds of nations, East and West, Australia, England, Germany, all kinds of nations, Canada. So those are settled in RMB. the two nations, Australia and China, do not settle in U.S. dollars. So they got tremendous starting point momentum in global trade being done more and more in RMB. With this IMF announcement, they're going to continue with the RMB trade and start loading up with RMB bonds. And the ironic, stupid criticism you hear out of Wall Street and London is that the Chinese don't have sufficient volume of their debt securities. In other words, they don't have the big advantage that the Americans have of $18 trillion in debt and two-thirds of that floating in the Treasury bond market as wonderful assets. Now, we call our debt securities assets when really they're debt obligations leading toward a default and the United States losing control of its own nation. So you got many steps involved, and let's be sure to mention the two important Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. That acronym is going to become a household word. That's pushing out the World Bank and the IMF. Remember, IMF is an empty office with the man-child Christine or Christopher Lagarde in charge. They don't have any money in their accounts. And the money that they granted to Ukraine, I think it was 2.3 billion or 3.2 billion. I can't remember. I think it was 3.2. That 3.2 billion given to Kiev leaders was on condition that they prosecute further the war. So it was a war grant. And here's the ultimate irony. Most of it was stolen. So whenever the IMF has grants, they have to dig up the money because they don't have any. And when they do dole it out, they're giving it to their fascist regimes, friends, to continue war where the money is stolen. So the other big important fund is called the Crisis Reserve Account. And that's really kind of the anti-hot money account. If you have another incident like 1998 in Thailand, the Asian meltdown, well, they're going to be ready. If hot money exits, the Crisis Reserve Account's going to be ready. They want to fund it with $100 billion. And you know, when they fund the AIIB and the Crisis Reserve Account with $100 billion each, and the New Development Fund, New Development Bank with $100 billion each, you got to ask the question: where does the money come from? It's Treasury bonds. So the Treasury bonds are going to be dumped in a huge way. And I like to point out, if they've got this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, and it's for development of major projects, infrastructure, bridges, roads, port facilities, you name it, electrical generating facilities, then why is the New Development Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, why does it have the word development in there? I have an answer. It's controversial, but I stick with it. I think it's going to be borne out to be extremely relevant and true to the core. The BRICS New Development Bank is really the BRICS Gold Central Bank. And the money that's being contributed as seed for the New Development Bank is going to be converted to gold to become the decentralized BRICS Gold Central Bank, with at least 5 central banks and probably more satellite central banks among the alliance nations to the BRICS alliance. So, the New Development Bank is not about development. It's a misnomer to keep the enemy quiet and not on alert. So now you finally have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank coming out with the word investment and implying development. They're out in the open, and it contradicts the New Development Bank. I think this is a coming out party, this AIIB. It fits in with the coming out party of the International Monetary Fund with inclusion of RMB. We're pretty much here dealing with game over, writing on the wall. We're going to see trade dictate the banking policies, because trade is already growing leaps and bounds in RMB settlement. We're going to see more of it. And as these nations like Korea move in more RMB bonds. You're going to see them buying crude oil in the Persian Gulf from the Gulf Emirate nations and paying for it in RMB and not the dollar and not these short-term treasury bills. So this is, I think, a step that's going to smash the petrodollar. And these nations of the world are going to say, we don't need these treasury bonds in our banking system, and besides, QE has rendered them toxic. Now, this is game over. The trade is going to dictate Forex and banking policy, not the other way around. This is upending of the petrodollar and upending of the dollar and the beginning of a massive dumping in the next few years of treasury bonds. I mean like trillions. And the big question is going to be how much of it is going to be devoted to buying gold. And then you're going to have questions like there's not enough gold to go around, so let's double the price and reopen the mines. Because most of them are unprofitable now.
Yeah, Jim, I think a lot of this, like almost none of this stuff that you were saying, whether it's the Asian Infrastructure Bank or what China's planning to do, the IMF, I'm not sure all these plans were in place prior to 2008, but 2008 was a big wake-up call for the rest of the world. And, after 2008, these things behind the scenes with the G20 and the developing world, they started to be put into place, and they took a number of years for the foundation to be laid. But now you're starting to see, whether it's the currency swaps and so many other things set up to where, they're working on a really legitimate alternative system because I guess they're fed up. And we've seen statements from either Chinese academics who provide policy counseling to key decision makers in China, and other people say that, they're fed up with the system. The system's run by corrupt people in the United States, etc. I know I've seen that on Kuz Jansen's site from Chinese officials and other places.
Well, the alternative system is coming into place. And one of the big pieces that has come into being lately and expected to grow leaps and bounds again is this CIP. I don't know exactly what it stands for, but it's basically a competitor to SWIFT. It's going to be called CHIPS. But it's a system of bank transactions that it works in parallel and in opposition, rather, to SWIFT. So they're going to have their bank transaction system with China. They've already got their new Daegong debt rating systems. They've got the UnionPay credit card system. You've got a lot of what I call the supporting platforms in place, being implemented. They're way past the planning stages. This is how the dollar dies. The line that we would hear 3 or 4 years ago is the dollar would be around a long time. There's nothing there to replace it. Now you're seeing the platforms precisely to replace it in trade, and eventually you're going to see gold trade notes. Gold trade notes used as letters of credit and not the U.S. Treasury bills. This is how the dollar goes away. And once you have a significant critical mass of RMB trade combined with gold trade notes for managing trade payments, you're going to see pressure, a screaming pressure to get rid of the dollar and make a domestic-only dollar. And that's when you're going to see the devaluation come. And that's when you're going to see the hue and cry and screaming and moaning by the American public who say, wait a minute, these import prices are out of this world. They just doubled the import prices. Well, yeah, that's what happens. That's what happens when you have a 30% devaluation of your currency.
Now, Jim, switching topics here, talk about devalued currency. It seems, talking either with Jim Rickards or other experts, some of them say there's a global currency war going on, but other of my friends who are also very financially savvy say that just governments and central banks are coordinating things and taking turns with QE to devalue currency in profit markets. Where do you stand on this issue?
Well, to begin with, when QE began in 2000, and I think it was 12, early in 12, we had a preview of it coming in 2011. It was one of my forecasts in 2010. We're going to see QE in the United States. And when it came, I said it's going to be there to infinity. It'll never leave. Remember, Alan Greenspan had some very wise words. He said, QE is dangerous policy. He didn't go into great detail on how it was dangerous, but he said it cannot stand as a regular policy for more than 6 to 9 months because it causes a lot of problems. He didn't go into detail unless you want to pull out some of his research papers. But the problems that it causes is it kills capital and forces up the cost structure. At the same time, they cannot raise prices of shirts and shoes and various things because the Chinese are producing them at lower cost. All right, so you have QE to infinity going on. Remember the taper talk in the summer of 2013. I called it a bunch of BS. And by the end of the year, it was rather clear. It was a trial balloon that failed. So we've got QE to infinity, but now they've been doing something clever. And this is not at all a surprise. I've always known, ever since 2012, that the Euro Central Bank was using and tapping a $2.3 trillion dollar swap facility. A dollar swap facility with $2.3 trillion access. So they tap it and they buy treasuries. And lo and behold, the long-term rate on the bonds goes down. Lower bond yields. Everybody's happy. Easy to support the stock market. And isn't this a grand success story? But it's not just a dollar swap facility that they tap. They put on $8 trillion worth of interest rate swap derivatives in the last half of 2010 and the first half of 2011. Morgan Stanley managed it. So we've got really the bond market gone amok. And now you've seen something happen that is remarkable. And I give them credit. A year ago now, I was talking about the Belgian bulge of $425 billion worth of treasury bonds sitting in the account for the Belgian government as asset holdings. And it was really more like a clearinghouse account. And it was really more like the Fed finding a nice hidey hole. But it also could have been mixed in with a bunch of BRICS nations sourcing gold through Cyprus. And that's one of the reasons Cyprus got shut down. The Russians were managing a tremendous conversion of treasury bonds to gold in Cyprus. So no war out there has an actual stated cause. It's usually hidden in defense of the dollar. Now a remarkable new set of hidey holes has come about. And it's not the BRICS. The BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's the BLICS with an L. Belgium, Luxembourg, Ireland, Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. And here's the statistic. Since the middle of 2011, all through 2014, so we're talking about 3.5 years, the Fed has added $825 billion in treasury bonds to their balance sheet, but the BLICS have added $818 billion. Wow. So the Fed has exported QE. Now, they're using these 5 nations that are under our thumb to buy up treasury bonds with money that we give them. So now the Fed is saying we're not buying as many treasury bonds. Well, I don't know what it is, but it's just standard Reich finance. So, this is not going to end well. I think the Fed is clearly exporting their QE policy, and what they're trying to do now is make the QE go global. So all the nations, all the major and secondary, these are secondary nations now. Cayman Islands is not secondary, but if you take a look at the TIPS report, you'll see the Caribbean Banking Center as one entry. That's basically the offshore nonsense done by the Bank of England. So now Cayman is like the capital of the Caribbean Offshore Center. Oh, my goodness. I was surprised to see Ireland in there, but it is what it is. This is the Treasury bond market destroyed, Jason. It's lacking liquidity. It has messed up reverse repo. It has messed up dollar swap. And now they've got exported QE to try to keep this thing held together. The East is going to say, we don't want any treasuries for trade. That's what the East is going to say.
Yeah, I agree. It seems like they're using bubblegum and duct tape, and they come up with, they keep changing all the rules and coming up with new weird programs and, covert and overt types of programs just to keep, by themselves another couple weeks or another couple months or things like that. But they're running out of road because I think, like you said, the people in the East are just fed up. They're fed up with being screwed over and lied to and spied on, and so many of the other different reasons. And there's so many now, like with the corruption in the U.S.
Well, let me ask a rhetorical question. If you saved a certain object, let's just say Model T cars, or bring it to our generation, Chevy Powerglide cars. You saved them, and every month you bought a few more with your hard-earned savings. And then you learned that the Americans were falsifying the manufacture of the Chevy Powerglide and making them out of paper. Would you feel insulted that your savings account in Chevy Powerglide cars was being undermined by the counterfeit with paper? Of course you would. QE is undermining the Eastern savings accounts, and Americans don't look at it that way. They think of it as stimulus, like the morons that 90% of them are. When you print money, you undermine whatever asset class is used to buy that printed money. And that is the U.S. government debt, which is predominantly held by the emerging market nations of the world in exchange for their hard-earned output from industry. So we've got a bit of an unwanted, an undesired consequence from 30 years of outsourcing, Jason. We've outsourced industry to India, the Pacific Rim, and China, and all kinds of nations. And they've got savings accounts. And they've stored it in treasury bonds predominantly. And now we're printing money to buy them. So we're undermining and turning toxic the Eastern savings. Americans don't look at it like that because they're not that smart. And they're badly educated. And they don't know jack shit about economics. They don't know what money is. They don't know what capitalism is. The minority of them do, who follow gold, who follow the hat-trick letter, who subscribe to the hat-trick letter. They know what money is. I have a funny little experience that happened 2 months ago. A guy said to me, I can't buy a bunch of gold coins, Jim, because I'm about to get married, and my fiancée says no, she doesn't want us to devote our huge amount of money towards something risky like gold. And I said to him, ask your sweetheart if she can distinguish between money, legal tender, and the dollar.
Yeah.
And if she can't, she does not participate in the decision.
Yeah, something tells me she doesn't know what Gresham's Law is.
Right. Bad money pushes out good. And that's what we're seeing in spades. And I get that kind of comment once in a while. And it often comes in the form of, well, we don't want to risk too much because buying gold could be risky, and there's a downside to it that you can't sell it in an emergency to pay the bills. And I always tell people, well, if you don't need the cash, and put 70% of your savings in gold and silver and heavily overweight with silver. But I love this issue about risk. My father says, Jim, I don't want to buy gold. It's very high risk. I said, Dad, you put your money in bank CDs, and you don't even know what your risk is. You've got what's called an unsecured credit on your CDs and your savings accounts, and you don't even know what it is.
Well, I think a lot of people don't understand risk, Jim. I mean, there's risk getting out of bed each day. I worked in the financial services industry, and it's risk trusting most people in the financial services industry. So most of them are just salesmen trying to sell you the highest commission piece of junk product that they can. A lot of them are, at least that's what I was taught at one of the firms I worked at in sales meetings. So, and I'm sure a lot of them are that way too, because I've spoken off the record with a number of people, both on the podcast and off this podcast. So I guess people just it's mentally uncomfortable for them to be contrarian, and they're not hearing on TV that gold's a good investment and stuff like that. So they're kind of herd mentality, I guess.
Well, there's a lot of herd mentality, and I feel sorry for them because they're not able to do critical thinking on their own. The herd has been hearing that there's no price inflation and there's sluggish growth, and the jobless rate is down to 5%. It's really almost 5 times that. So, I don't give too much credit to the herd who swallows this crapola whole. I mean, yeah, take some milk with that bullshit you're swallowing. I get tired of it all. I began critical thinking. This is going to sound a little weird, but I was 11 years old when Kennedy was killed. And I asked my father, why did the Warren Commission want to close the conclusion of the report so quickly without looking at a lot of evidence? I was 11. And he said, I don't know, Jim, I guess the nation's hurting and we need to move on. I said, well, isn't it important to get it right? 11 years old. I was a contrarian. Well, I was contrarian before that. Different. Huh?
Sounds like you had common sense and you want to pursue the truth. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with that, but in the society we live now, it's like what Ron Paul says and George Orwell said. I mean, or George Orwell said something similar. I mean, truth is treason now in the Empire of Lies. I think Ron Paul's actually, a friend of mine's actually working on the first officially sanctioned Ron Paul documentary about his life and, truth is treason and stuff like that.
Well go ahead.
Switching to the next topic here, speaking of someone who doesn't really like speaking the truth a lot or is very squirrely, billionaire and hypocritical progressive George Soros says World War III is coming soon between the U.S. and China. What do you think about his thoughts?
Well, I think he'd love to see more war. He's kind of like a diabolical center of controversy, war, conflict. He pays. I just got an email. This is the truth. I got an email yesterday from a hat-trick letter client in Hong Kong. And he said, Jim, you'll find this interesting. I was talking to the janitor in my building the other day, and he told me that his son was paid 300 Hong Kong dollars per day and 400 Hong Kong dollars per night to go demonstrate, yell things, carry placard, and throw stuff in the islands dispute with China and Japan. Now, 300 Hong Kong dollars divided by 7, you're talking about $40. Okay, so $40. We're not talking about big money, but this is paid by Soros. Soros is paying for some of the demonstrators in Ferguson, Missouri. Soros is paying for a lot of things. He paid some of the bill for the Kiev overthrow coup d'etat in Ukraine. He's a piece of scum. He made his money by selling out Jews in World War II and confiscating their money. This is not a good guy. So he's a troublemaker and a warmonger and a killer. He's also funding, along with Microsoft's founder Bill Gates. This is not stuff I'm making up. You can research this. Soros and Gates were funding the Sierra Leone facility for fabricating the different strains of the Ebola virus in Sierra Leone, West Africa. This is a Soros project. And the controversy has come because in Sierra Leone and Liberia and Ghana, there's one other country there, I can't remember the name, but the Red Cross workers are being murdered because the natives are realizing the only people who are sick are the ones who are receiving the vaccine. This is what these guys are doing. Soros and Gates. Soros needs to be locked up tried for mass murder and hanged by the neck. China does own significant U.S. government debt. Now, I dispute that they even own $1 trillion. And there's been a lot of stories lately about how China once had $1.3 trillion in U.S. government debt, treasury bonds, and now they're down to $1.0 trillion, and Japan is slightly higher. Well, I dispute that. I bet you China has no more than 700 billion, which is still a lot. But I think they've got all kinds of pledges for their trillion in treasury bonds for, say, forward swaps of RMB, forward swaps of Russian ruble, forward contracts for buying more office buildings in western cities, buying farmlands, all to be executed in the future, the near future, forward contracts. Furthermore, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of reports that there was a 1920s era very large debt that the U.S. government defaulted against, and the Chinese were the creditor. And this happened apparently in mid-April. Very hard to confirm this, but it seems like this is not the first default that the U.S. and Wall Street has had with respect to the Chinese. I believe that there was a default in 2012 regarding what Rob Kirby described. You know, we conjecture, we try to piece things together, but Rob conjectured that in order to secure the gold lease in 1999 as part of the most favored nation grant, the most favored nation grant given to China, that opened up in just the next 3 years $23 billion of Western corporate investment. In other words, they made and constructed, built shiny new industries. And the Japanese were involved in that. Europeans were involved in that. A lot of American firms were involved in that. But the Chinese, as part of the deal, said, all right, most favored nation trade status, we'll take that. But we want for our lease of gold, which I believe was something on the order of 5,000 tons, 3,000 to 5,000 tons of gold. They wanted to secure it. And the story goes that the J.P. Morgan organized Internal Revenue Service tax secured stream. Think of it as a mortgage bond for the United States. They made a securitized bond out of it, an aggregate national bond. And with the tremendous recession, we defaulted on it. It was set up in 1999 and 2000, and we defaulted on it in around 2009. So that's why the Chinese property conglomerate bought the J.P. Morgan headquarters. And that's why the Chinese, I don't know which exactly the entity was, bought controlling interest, all very secretive, for the Federal Reserve. So I don't think we're going to have any war with China because they already own us. They're going to be trying. They got us by the short hairs. They got us by the neck. They got us by the debt. And I think they are a principal party, Jason, for keeping the gold price down because they're trying to convert more and more of their treasury bonds. And I believe they're lying about what they hold in treasury bond assets at their central bank. I think they're dumping them in a magnificent way. And you could say, well, aren't they buying a lot of African property? Aren't they buying a lot of, Kenyan property? Aren't they buying port facilities and more mining facilities in Australia? Aren't they investing in hard assets? Well, yeah, but I don't think it adds up to more than $5 or $7 billion a year, maybe 10. There was a time back in 2011 and 12 and 13, they were racking up $20 and $25 billion in treasuries every month. They couldn't invest it that fast. So I think we're not going to see any war. We're going to see a trade war, and we're going to see a white flag, just like we saw the U.S. hand Putin in Kiev, a white flag of surrender. The Chinese control the IMF now as the only contributor. They control the Fed. They control J.P. Morgan. And one of their action deeds recently is to accumulate millions of ounces of silver in the J.P. Morgan vaults. Why? Because they're converting treasury bonds to silver too. Now, the Chinese groups are actively becoming law enforcers. They're going to be hunting down these elite criminals. I've already heard that they're using the triad for some hits, murders, hits. They're going to become the next leader and lender of gold bullion for the U.S. dollar-backed currency. When the dollar must be backed by gold in order to guarantee trade supply, you're going to see a frantic move for a few things. The first is foreigners are going to say, prove your deep storage gold because we don't believe you. We think Fort Knox is empty. We think it's long gone. We think Rubin and Clinton raided it all with Paulson following. It's all gone. The second thing you're going to see is a lot of pressure for those who stole and took advantage of the gold carry trade with the 0% lease during the Clinton administration. That was set up by Robert Rubin, the Treasury Secretary. He wasn't made Treasury Secretary by accident. He was made it in order to raid the gold. It wasn't theft. It was leasing it and selling it into the market. The theft comes about in that they will never return it. It's a lease, 0% gold lease through the 1990 decade. If they don't give it back, then it's not leased, it's stolen. It's like having a car, a loan, and you never pay on your bill, and you drive off to Mexico with your car. Well, it's on a lease, it's on a loan, yeah, but you just stole it because you're not making the payments, and you're not around anymore. This is what the U.S. government does, and the whole world is on to what we do. So I think the Chinese are going to be important. Very big point for industrial parks. They've already got a dozen. They're all through Idaho and upstate New York, and I think California has a few.
I think
they've
Alabama
got industrial parks. And Jason, I think that's going to be a grand phase toward reindustrializing the United States, and the Chinese are going to be the masters. It's going to be colonialization.
And speaking of someone who thinks she's a master, talking about a political elite like Hillary Clinton, all the scandals, why, in your opinion, do political elites like Hillary Clinton get mostly a free pass from the mainstream media, Justice Department, etc., when it seems there's, mountains of evidence for felonies and other high-level crimes she's committed?
Because they kill people.
Now,
if someone steps forward with evidence, they kill them. They have dozens. I think it's up to 3 dozen murders that the Clintons have been involved with, including Ron Brown, who was the Commerce Secretary, including Vincent Foster, who was the White House Chief of Staff for just a matter of weeks. On his first mission to go to Switzerland and pay off a $250 million payment, he balked, he came back, and they killed him. This is why. Treason is now a job requirement on the resume for highest office in the United States. Treason. Billion-dollar bond fraud is a requirement for vice president at Goldman Sachs. That's a known fact. You want to become a VP at Goldman Sachs? What's on your resume? What's the biggest thing you, quote, got away with? Arranged, engineered.
How much money did you launder for drug cartels or, yeah.
Remember, it was just a few months ago, maybe close to a year ago, Hillary was before the Congress in a Senate committee, and they were grilling her about the Benghazi Libyan embassy incident, and she almost yelled, "What does it matter?" What is her it? What is her antecedent for it? It is treason. What does treason matter? Hillary is saying. So in order to become presidential timber, you either have to be a robot under control who can read the teleprompter well, or a person who's committed treason in defense of the dollar. So what was Benghazi all about? Well, they were using it as an arms shipment center to go after Egypt and Syria, and it became known, so it became under attack. And there was a lot more going on there. For instance, we wanted to make sure that Gaddafi was murdered because he had a personal account in London of 144 tons of gold. And after he was disemboweled in a culvert, some British authorities came forth and explained 10 conditions for the Gaddafi gold to be returned to the Libyan people, and I guarantee you, they will never be satisfied and they will never see their gold. And here's another little factoid for you. Syria owns an equal 140 tons of gold. So we're trying to do a regime change. We're trying to do a destabilization. We're doing a vilification of the Assad. I mean, Assad is not a good guy, but neither's Clinton.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any good guys that are really head of politicians. I can't really name any off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think the most good politicians who are true leaders of their people and have a very high rating of approval tend to be in Eurasia, like Russia and China. So, I'd like to point out another thing regarding Hillary. It's not just the Benghazi incident. She deleted a whole stack of emails, which is an illegal act as a public servant. When she was head of the State Department, she was the Secretary of State before the reconstructed John Kerry took over. Why did he take over? Because they threw Hillary under the bus. She just hasn't been run over yet by the big tires. One of the things that was involved, in addition to the Benghazi evidence, where orders were given like, let the ambassador get killed, who cares anyway? Stuff like that. I'm making it up, but I guarantee you that's kind of the theme on some of those emails. She deleted a bunch of emails having to do with $5 billion of missing funds in the State Department under her watch. This is what Clintons do. They steal billions. And morons voted for Hillary to become the senator from New York. And what were her qualifications 10 years ago? Nothing. Nothing. Wife of a president, and maybe had a good secretarial position in some of the bond theft and cocaine dealings running out of Rose Law Firm in Arkansas. What were her qualifications for senator of New York, you idiots in New York listening? Nothing.
She was good at raising money, and her face looked good on the popularity contest, I guess. I guess that's the stuff they justify. But everything, Jim, just seems so Orwellian here because, there seems to me like a lot of clear evidence that Hillary should be charged, with so many different crimes, felonies. And yet, we have an honest, hardworking guy like Edward Snowden who he went to his bosses, tried to get reform in the system. He told everyone, right? And now his life's in danger, and he's like, they're trying to ruin him financially, and he's out of the system and stuff. So it seems like, good behavior that's honest and moral seems to get penalized now in the world we live in, especially in the Western world. And, the people, the psychopaths like Hillary who write the laws, they think they're above the law, and that, the laws where you and me, if we did them, we would be in a lot of trouble, maybe our life in prison, our asses confiscated. Those laws don't seem to apply to her. It seems that the justice system is, it doesn't apply to the political and economic elites anymore.
No, if you steal a few $1,000s, you get a year or two prison time. If you steal $100,000 or $1 million, you might get 10 years prison time, 12 years prison time. You steal $1 billion, you're on the short list for Secretary of Treasury.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. It definitely seems that way. There's so many scandals now involved in so many corrupt politicians at all levels of society, especially in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe and other areas have the same way. It's just really mind-boggling that the people vote these clowns in. I don't know what their problem is.
Well, how about another one? Caroline Kennedy, zero experience in accounting, zero experience in any kind of diplomacy, zero experience in any kind of a business, yet she was made ambassador to Japan, and my idiot brother, who's got a political science and a double major of political science and economics and really doesn't know much of anything about economics anymore and doesn't apparently know much even what fascism is anymore, he thought that having Caroline would be a good move to be ambassador to Japan, and all she ends up doing is going over and licking Abe's ass. I'd like to point out a final story, Jason. This is a personal story regarding Hillary, because what Hillary cannot run away from is her past. And I may get some flack on this, but I'm just going to put it in terms of what Julie told me in late 2000 and early 2001, when we had a long-distance dating relationship that was online, and we did get together and have some heated moments. She's in San Francisco, and I hope she's still doing well, but we parted ways for a number of reasons. We were in a long conversation once, and I said, Julie, where'd you go to college? And when? And she said, well, it was the late 70s, and I went to Wellesley College. And do you know where it is? You're from Boston, right? And I said, yeah, I spent 20 years in Boston. I know exactly where Wellesley College is. I used to ride my bike around their campus, around their lake, and, check out some of the ladies running around. It's an all-girls school. And I said, well, you must know a little bit about what's going on with Hillary, because she went there. Did you know anybody who knew her? And she said, did I know anybody who knew her? I met her. And I said, really? Well, you're a friend? I wouldn't call her a friend of mine, but I knew her, and I knew a bunch of her friends. I knew a couple of her lesbian friends. And I said, oh, really? So that is true. She said, oh, it's not only true, but she had the reputation of being the most wild and out of control of the lesbians. And she said, Jim, are you aware that Wellesley College is 70% lesbian? And I said, no, I knew it was significant, but I didn't ever hear a figure. But you're a graduate of Wellesley. Did you finish 4 years there? Oh, yeah. Where'd you live that time? Oh, I lived in the dormitories all 4 years. Were you in the same dormitory as Hillary on any of those years? Oh, yeah. I think 1 or 2 of those years. I said, did you ever bump into her? Oh, yeah. In fact, Hillary had a distinction. She was a really vulgar woman. She swore a lot, and very few people liked her who knew her, but she had a number of partners. And Hillary had a disgusting habit of leaving her door open when receiving oral sex in her room.
Yeah, that sounds like Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson, there's some biographies that have come out about him. He was pretty much a monster, too. Very vulgar, did a lot of really bad things as well in terms of treating, his bodyguards bad, his friends bad, his employees bad. I heard, I know you said you haven't watched House of Cards yet on Netflix, but the wife of Underwood, I think Claire Underwood, I think a lot of it's based off Hillary. So if you want to go check that out, there's some stuff in there. But yeah, I've heard the stories about her being a lesbian and doing all these crazy sex things with men and women and orgies and stuff like that. So none of this stuff surprises me. I've heard that from some of my political contacts too, because I live right outside of D.C. So
well, my Secret Service contact, I've got a guy who sits occasionally on Homeland Security meetings, and he knows some Secret Service people. One of the favorite things that Hillary liked to do was to put on a strap-on and administer to Bill from behind. I mean, this is some sick, weird stuff. I mean, I'm a liberal-minded fellow when it comes to the bedroom, but, I kind of like boy on girl. I had an incident a few weeks ago that's kind of funny. Some reconstructed man turned woman approached me at a sports bar and said, hi, Poppy, what are you doing, in Spanish? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. And he said to me again, hi, Poppy, what are you doing? I said, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. I prefer girls. It was a man reconstructed to look like a girl. with
Well,
implants.
Well, technology is changing the world in a lot of interesting ways, Jim. We have cheap debt now available and artificially low interest rates, and politicians in Los Angeles and Seattle and so many other areas trying to hike minimum wages. We see robots now and touchscreens and all that starting to replace a lot of human jobs coming down the pipe. I think even China, a lot of their factories now are starting to switch out robots, and there's so many other examples of, plastic surgery technology and so many of these other things that are changing our lives in weird and unexpected ways.
And we've had some positive changes that we've recognized as being good and improving efficiency. But, going to an ATM, I remember I was a kid, and until college, there were no ATM machines. You went to the bank and you cashed a check. You stood in line. Now you go to an ATM machine, and it's a good idea to go at 9 p.m. when there are very few people running around, and you don't even have to wait in line for the ATM. There's another one of running your credit card through the gasoline pump machine and saying, I want $20 worth of gasoline, and I want high test or medium grade or whatever, regular. And that's a good thing. You don't have to wait for the young kid to come out. Wait 5 minutes for him not to be busy, come out of the bathroom or do whatever. Don't have to get his oily hands on your car and your gas cap. Okay, these are progress, but we're getting to the point now where you might see a very small number of humanoids in a manufacturing plant. So we're getting to some evolutionary clashes with society, as you mentioned. And I don't know how it's all going to turn out, but for now, I would at least like to try to fix the trade payment system and the bank reserve system by going to the gold trade standard and having it dictate the gold currency standard and the gold banking standard. Those three standards, backed by gold, fortified, will bring about an honest system and honest markets, and we can get on with capitalism and put an end to this 2-decade-old nightmare of fascism that's not going to culminate in the New World Order. It's going to be the new Silk Road World Order. I love that. That's a Pepe Escobar phrase. New Silk Road Order.
Yeah, I would love to see. Yeah, I would love to see transparency and sound money and honesty and more morality in the system where people focus, on value creation and investing in new products and services that benefit society and, make people's lives better. And instead of the stuff that's been going on, where there's new technology to spy on us and enslave us and new schemes to come up with how to devalue money and lie and inflate and things like that. It's just getting very frustrating. But I don't think the status quo can continue for very much longer.
Well, the status quo is printing money and wrecking capital, and you can't do that forever because you run out of capital to support the system. It does not have enough profitability in order to engage the system and keep it with income. So we're breaking the system with the status quo. We're running out of time. I'd like to see an end of stupidity, like the Obama economic stimulus being handouts to families. We don't even know how to create wealth anymore in the United States. I want to see some legitimate capital formation. It's called capitalism. Fascists do not like capital unless they can control it and exploit it for the elite purposes. We need some middle level, middle class, lower class formation of capital to make new businesses and to get rid of this Obamacare that's inhibiting capital formation. It's one of the main... Savings. Well, it not only limits savings, but it just cuts out new business formation. You get people saying, I'd like to expand the business, but I'm not going to with the Obamacare. I'd like to start a new business. I'm not going to with Obamacare. It's inhibiting capital formation. We don't even know what capitalism is anymore in the United States. I asked a question when I started my newsletter. It was kind of a fun exercise when I went out to parties, gatherings, sporting events, movie with a friend, a few friends. I asked 40 different people in 04 and 05, what is fascism? I had one correct answer. One. Lots and lots of stupid answers, and one or two that were close, but they weren't the right answer. It's a merging of the state with big business with a hidden motive to defraud the system and to allow the elites in control to go with full impunity on their criminality. That is the fascist business model, and I'm going to be writing a public article in the next couple of weeks. I got one more that I'd like to do tomorrow. It's not related to this, but it's going to be titled The Bitter Fruit of the Fascist Business Model. It's going to point out the failures in the United States as a result of permitting fascism to take root. I believe fascism took root when they killed Kennedy. I think American fascists killed Kennedy, installed Kissinger as Secretary of State, got rid of the gold standard of Bretton Woods, and convinced the Arabs to recycle their petrodollars into treasury bonds. And that created the petrodollar standard, which was kind of a de facto replacement standard for gold. I believe that killing Kennedy was part of the plan that installed Nixon and Kissinger, got rid of the gold standard, and signed up the Arabs. So that's when fascism started in the United States. It's been all downhill since. With outsourcing in the 80 decade, with war after war. Take a look at the war bills, and you find that it's right around 10 of the $18 trillion of the war bill. I mean, of the U.S. government debt. War bill is over half the $18 trillion. What do we have for it? We have a lot of profits for the people. Well, a lot of profits, Jason, for the people invested in the military complex.
Well, the Iraqi war was supposed to pay for itself with oil profits, right? That's a lie that they tried to sell the American people on, right? One of the major reasons why we went into Iraq, right?
Yeah, and if you take a close look at the Iraq Reconstruction Fund, you'll find that Kissinger stole $2.3 billion, along with the help of Tenet, who received a Congressional Medal of Honor. So, as I said, treason is the calling card for high office.
None of this surprises me. I mean, look at the history of the Roman Empire. As Rome was burning, the people at the top were trying to steal everything that wasn't nailed down. So, I mean, this is what happens with empires.
They had a trick back then. They would remove the gold from the coins. They actually called it sovereignty. And so the coins gradually had less and less gold in it, and the gold was stolen by the elite leaders. In the U.S., Bush and Clinton and Rubin did something one better. They just stole it all by making it 0% lease. So they leased the gold, and they bought treasury bonds, and they profited from both ends. I believe the Wall Street gang made on the order of $2 to $3 trillion by gutting Fort Knox and investing in treasury bonds with futures contracts, loading on the leverage. $2 to $3 trillion. Where's our gold now that we need to do a gold-backed currency to guarantee our incoming supply chain for trade? We don't have any. It's all stolen.
No one said, Jim, that market manipulation wasn't profitable. I mean, I've read this book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and Madness of Crowds. I don't know if you've read it, but it goes back through many bubbles, and government-created bubbles and market-created bubbles throughout history in Europe and things like that, South Sea bubble, Mississippi bubble, etc. And, there was always government or political insiders or key financial people always trying to manipulate markets to make extra money. So I'm not surprised that you told me, they made that much money off of manipulation. We've been here going for almost an hour and a half. I think this is about time to wrap it up. I really enjoyed this discussion. Please tell our listeners more about the Hat-Trick Letter and goldenjackass.com.
Okay, I'll be very brief to close this. The website is www.goldenjackass.com. Just past the 11th anniversary. Been a labor of love, been a lot of work, occasional exhaustion. but I get my rest and I get recharged. I'm in good health. The main web page, the public domain web page, has a bunch of links of public articles and interviews like this. But the main flagship product, it's a business. I'm the editor of the Hat Trick Letter, and it's a monthly publication. I hope people go to the website, learn a bit if they're new, learn a little bit more if they're not new to the topic in the field of gold and currency, bonds, and central bank policy, because the dollar is in its death spiral right now, and people had better be careful that they're holding too many dollars, that they're holding instruments that are dollar-related, like stocks, bonds, CDs, and banks, because there's going to be, I believe, a tremendous write-down on their perceived money, and I don't call it money. It's paper investments. I don't think they can, the victims of the upcoming phase, the final phase, I don't think they could distinguish the issue, the three-part issue that I had before of legal tender, money, and the dollar. I don't think it could define the differences. So they're going to be the principal victims, but the Hat Trick Letter helps people to protect their life savings, helps them to understand what's going on, helps them to decipher what the truth is out of all the events in place and how to dismiss the many lies. So we do a pretty good job. I've got a very strong informal staff from a wide variety of backgrounds, and we all work together. They're not on any official payroll or anything. We just have a circle in our emails, and we chew over things. We discuss things. We hypothesize. We disprove. We add opinions, and in that manner, I'm able to come up with forecasts and interpretations of things that are going on, and they make me look really smart. I mean, I didn't expect that the Belgian bulge of the $425 billion in treasury bonds held by the Belgian central bank, I didn't know or figure out or link that to any kind of BRICS nation gold sourcing. But I think it was a combination of that and QE hidden support that they didn't want to have on the New York books. So it's a complicated situation. We're in a global financial war, and the dollar is going to lose the war, and the U.S. government is going to surrender its debt to the war. The victim is going to be the U.S. people and the U.S. economy. But we're going to rise up. It's going to be a troublesome period, though, in transition. So I invite people to come to www.goldenjackass.com and lounge around and sign up for the Hat Trick newsletter.
Okay, Jim. Well, thanks again for your time, and I enjoy our discussions, and we'll try to have you on again in a couple months, because it looks like there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. I'm really surprised they've kept things going this long, but the next couple months should be very interesting if you believe some of the predictions of some other experts out there.
I think the next several months, in particular the next 3 or 4, are going to be loaded with surprises and disruptive events that point out how the dollar will not continue.
Okay.